So I said in my last video that it's been like 2 or 3 weeks of the whole no caffeine thing, and I've been very sleepy. My cognition has not been the best. I've had trouble concentrating, but it's been improving. At first it was getting worse, now it's improving, but it's still not as good as it was pre-caffeine or post-caffeine. I'm still in this weird like middle type phase where my brain is still adjusting. And um, what I talked about in that other video is it's kind of strange how I got introduced to caffeine as like a consistent daily kind of thing, because it didn't happen until I was 19. Um, so I'm in kind of a weird position where I can actually remember what it felt like to think before caffeine, and I'm trying to get back to that. Um, I remember I wasn't consuming any caffeine when I was learning Japanese. Now, I didn't learn Japanese to fluency. I only spent a month and a half on it back when I was 17, but I was doing Anki for upwards of 5 hours a day, sometimes 4 or 5 hours straight, just doing Anki, and I was completely concentrated. I was not sort of diverting my attention towards other things and dividing it all up. No, I was only in that one world. Now, what I've found in this moment for me doing Anki, um, what I've found to be necessary is for me to kind of divide up the time that I spend on it. I didn't need to do this when I was consuming caffeine. I also didn't need to do this before I started consuming caffeine consistently. But right now, as I'm experiencing the cognitive fatigue as a result of withdrawal, I do need to do this to basically divide up the time I spend on Anki instead of doing it all in one go. What I find myself doing is, taking each question really slowly, taking each card really slowly, and then doing it later, later on in the day. So I do one part of it here, one part of it here, one part of it there, and then eventually it gets done. It's a lot slower to do the same amount of work I was doing before, but it helps me because I'm not putting this huge strain on my brain, which is currently adapting to not consuming caffeine. Um, in addition to that, I have been doing a lot more listening in Spanish, which has been pretty nice, and my listening has improved quite a bit because of the time that has added up at this point, the amount of time I've spent doing it. Also, because of the sheer amount of Anki I've done up to this point, it gives me a pretty good sense for like what all the words are and what they mean. What they mean. There I go yawning, you know? It's in the middle of the day for me. It's not right at the beginning or right at the end of the day, but I'm yawning all the time because my body is getting used to the lack of caffeine. But um, yeah, what was I saying? I'm trying to remember now. And that's the other thing, is like as my brain is getting used to all this, my memory has taken a hit. So I'm sort of like trying to get it all together here, but um, yeah, what was I saying? I don't remember anymore. But um, yeah, basically I was one way, then I was another, and now I'm another, but will soon be a different way. And that's the strange world I'm living in. Oh yeah, yeah. I remember now. But the sheer amount of Anki I've done and other forms of studying too gives me, such a good foundation in the language that I can listen to most intermediate content with relative ease without really translating in my head or having to slow it down or something. I can just listen to it and it's fine. There's sometimes a couple words or ways of phrasing things I'm not totally familiar with, but then I can just familiarize myself with it. I can just add it to the list of things I need to learn. Okay, here's a new card or whatever. So it's still very much a process, but I've been enjoying the lack of stress and paranoia that I've been having in this caffeine-free state. Um, and it was about time because I talk about how I've been drug free for over 2 years now, but are you really that without also being caffeine free? I mean, I guess in a technical sense, no. In a colloquial sense, yes. But I'm sort of in this baseline. I'm developing this baseline of health and wellness, um, you know, and unaided by outside factors, um, which is really what I want. I don't want to be dependent on anything. I think that that's undesirable. Um, Not to say that I was dependent on anything back when I used to mess around with all the other stuff, but it's certainly not healthy to do that. If you're talking about wanting to live the longest life possible with your brain in the best shape possible, you really have to make sure everything in your life is ideal, right? You're eating all the best stuff, you're getting activity, you're socializing, you're not consuming these things which could be in some way toxic for your body. But all of that has to do with my specific goals, right? My specific goal is to be as non-reliant on these outside factors as possible, just completely rely on my own will and the stuff the stuff that I want to do. I'm so tired. I'm not particularly articulate in this video either. I'm just really really sleepy. I'm on the border of doing word salad, to be honest. I'm trying to hold it together the best I can, but um, it's going to take my body a moment to really get back to normal because I was a coffee consumer, I was an energy drink consumer for so long. I had breaks and stuff here and there over the years, but usually it was only for 2 weeks, 2 weeks so that I could go back to it and get more of a high octane kind of effect. Um, Not fucking like cold turkey fucking 3 weeks type shit. Like before, what I was doing was, okay, I'm gonna have a lower amount, or okay, I'm gonna go without for a week and a half after doing this lower amount, um and then I'm gonna go back to it. But no, man, I've just been fucking thugging it out, and I don't mind it because I don't really mind being sleepy and being tired, but it makes it hard to do these kinds of videos where I have to sit here and talk and think about stuff. It makes it hard to do the work that I normally do, but I've just been doing it anyway because that is a choice that you have, right? Lots of people are tired in lots of situations. They don't necessarily make it keep them from doing what they're supposed to do, motherfucker. And neither am I. I'm not gonna do that either. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm not really opposed to caffeine on a moral level or some stupid shit like that. I'm not I'm not opposed to any drug on a moral level. It's if people want to do whatever they want to do, they should. even if they want to do it in a dependent or consistent kind of way, I would say that's, in my opinion, that's not a prudent decision. That's not advisable. But hey, if it's working for them, it's like, who am I to tell them what to do? You know? If they want to do, if they really did like as objective of a value assessment as possible, and they are aware of all the risks and they're reducing the harm where they can, and they really think that doing this or that is just better for them than like the alternative, hey, who am I to say what's best for you? Like, go on, man, do it. You know what I'm saying? I don't really care what other people do. I think there's this strange impulse on the internet, or maybe just in society, this desire to like police other people's behavior or to condemn it. Um, I've never really understood that, the desire to do that. I feel like, if something is working for other people, they should do it. If something's working for me, then I should do it. I like what I'm doing. Just this total abstinence type routine. Um, and I don't really regret my past phases of experimentation either. I'm not against that. The fact that that happened, I remember I had fun. I learned some things, and it was relatively harmless. Didn't really result in any majorly bad outcomes. So, whatever, right? You know, that's just kind of how I see it. I don't, I'm not on like a war path against this stuff. I have this preference for how I want to do things, um, how I think things would go best for me. I know other people have a different view. Um, and the thing is, I see why, right? I wrote a whole blog post about it, about those positions. But for me, the most terrifying thing, besides having a shorter lifespan, the most terrifying thing is getting dumber. I really don't want to get dumber. And, um, it's the same reason why I avoid like food with certain preservatives or colored dyes. It's the same reason you know, um, I try to interact with people where I can, because it causes damage to your brain and your body over time if you don't. So there's all these things I try to do to take care of myself, because you got to get to it early. If you wait until you're later in life, well, all the damage has already been done, so you can't exactly undo that easily. Um, Although I do sort of wonder, like if somebody's drug use is really moderate, like it only happens um, as a really transient thing, like it's every now and then, um, is that person really doing significant damage to themselves? My assumption is probably not, unless they're consuming just like a particularly carcinogenic or neurotoxic substance, which, I mean, there are things like that out there, but um, not that many, right? And also, in a lot of cases, the people who experience that from certain things, look at the factors involved. A lot of the time, lack of sleep plays a contributing role. A lot of the time, not drinking enough water plays a role. Not having adequate nutrition is a big one in a lot of these cases. And maybe they would still do some damage to themselves, but they could significantly reduce their risk by engaging in harm reduction or informed use. So I feel like I have a pretty nuanced view of this stuff, even though I don't partake in it. Even in like at this point, like the most common thing, which is caffeine. Um, I don't really want to come on here and evangelize against this stuff, because I've known so many people who lead regular lives, taking after their obligations. You know, they're good members of their community, and yet they do even some of the quote unquote harder stuff just occasionally. There's lots of people out there like that. I think you just have to have kind of an open mind to accept it, that even if that's not for you or that's not what you want to do, that there are people out there like that. I just think that there's been, there's this image of somebody who uses drugs that we see, and we sort of assume that that is the poster boy for all drug use because they are the people that we see the most often. I'm talking about people who didn't make it through school, likely were sexually abused or have some other aggravating mental health factors, and they're on the street. They're on the street compulsively using these things, often exploited by gangs and other members of the community. And either they're really schizo or they just seem off, or it seems like they don't have any control at all. I think there's sort of this perception that any drug use leads to that, when statistically speaking that's not true. If you look at statistics even from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is the government's agency which is tasked to study this, a lot of the less scientific quote-unquote studies on the subject of drug abuse and addiction have been produced by NIDA. Is not a good institution by any means, but even in their own statistics, they show that with every single drug that you could name, the majority of people who try it or that engage in transient, infrequent use actually comprise the majority of people. It's not even a plurality of people that that happen to display patterns of dysfunction or habitual use. So, I guess that just kind of says to me that the entire narrative about this stuff is incorrect. Which it doesn't mean, okay, yeah, you should go out and do it or something. You probably shouldn't, because you're opening a door to a lot of risk that is unnecessary. But it does mean that the war on drugs and kind of the hegemonic positions that exist in society on this subject are misguided. They're not backed up by evidence or a scientific way of looking at the world. They're backed up by ideology. Ideology that the state has promoted specifically because it makes money from locking people up, private prisons, for example. There are entrenched power, like sections of power in the country that also benefit from this, such as police unions, right? If you're hiring more officers to do drug enforcement, police unions are doing better. That's a political institution. The police department in general lobbies on the behalf of things like this, so they want more of this enforcement to happen. They oppose even basic reforms like medical marijuana in many cases. So not exactly a neutral actor in all of this. So when you take together kind of the political motivations of the police department and of the prison industrial complex, you start to see why the war on drugs has such sticking power. But more than that, I think journalists are to blame as well, because there is an incentive in journalism to talk about things that garner headlines, to talk about things that bring a lot of attention to your work. And sensationalist stories about the negative effects of drugs are going to inevitably do much better than a story about someone having a neutral or positive experience. Now, there has recently been more coverage of positive experiences. Um, I would argue simply because there is so much money in, like, for example, psychedelic research that journalists, think that they can gain a lot of attention by talking about it, and they have. Um, but in general, in general, the incentive structure as it exists um, kind of pushes these writers towards negative coverage. I think part of the reason why those studies that they've been reporting on the last couple years have proven so successful for them is because the concept itself seems so absurd to people after decades of drug war propaganda. The concept of some of these drugs, some of the most vilified ones, actually having medicinal uses ends up being pretty crazy to people, and it drives clicks anyhow. That's my theory as to how those articles even started to get put out there in the first place. People like sort of these articles that feel like they're fighting against the tide, or saying something that's unintuitive but true, and it kind of makes them smart. I feel like they're smart if they're reading it. Um, but fundamentally, it's the same incentive structure at work, because the incentive structure is saying, okay, be sensationalist, say stuff that makes people emotional, and journalists are going to do that, which is another way in which this kind of hegemonic perspective on what this stuff is and what it does gets created. Because if the journalism class is um, putting out this relatively unified sensationalistic perspective, it creates the sense that that is the one perspective that exists, simply because you see it everywhere. But the reason why that's the perspective you see all the time is simply because it's the one that garners the most attention and therefore the most money. Um, Also, in many cases, journalists will first go to police for sources on these matters, or chemists and scientists that work directly for the police or the DEA, which are not, unbiased sources themselves. I mean, they have been the progenitors of countless forms of misinformation throughout the years now. It is literally their job to argue in court, sometimes against other scientists, on the behalf of the agency that they represent. So they're not neutral actors. And yet, the media itself treats them as such, treats them as a reputable source on these issues, which only further cements the kind of the broader media landscape that I'm talking about here, that manufactures consent for the war that we have been seeing over the past several decades. Um, so I think people have a resistance to being open-minded about that sort of stuff. People like myself who don't have, really a big interest in doing this stuff themselves. They just kind of want to have a good baseline and then that's it. Um, there is this distrust of the idea that lots of people, could have a good or responsible experience or be in control and this sort of thing, simply because of the media environment that we exist in, simply because of the perspective that has been filtered to us, that where all of the counterexamples have kind of been left out of the mainstream. They've been left on the fringes, even though they often exist. There are many of them. They're just not talked about. Um, so that kind of leads me to have the perspective that I do, which is, which is the legalized position, where I say, okay, let's just legalize all this stuff. Those are some of the reasons why. This idea that it's not going to lead to as bad of health outcomes as people tend to say, simply because our our perception of drugs and drug use is not a realistic one. It's not actually based on the reality. But the other reason why I end up having this perspective is because the drugs that so many people are already consuming are killing them, not even because of the dose that they took or the specific drug that they took, but because of the way it became tainted or cut with something else in the process of getting to them, because it's completely unregulated. By regulating the supply and allowing for it to be sold to the people who already want it, there's less of a risk of that same supply going on to kill them. If people are more educated and informed of how to actually consume these things safely, or as safely as possible, then you run less of a risk of it killing them. Um, and that education is more likely to exist in a society that doesn't stigmatize the behavior, in a society that readily educates people on it rather than encourages this sort of abstinence only policy. Um, and uh, and also at the same time, if something is to go wrong, there are ambulance services and things like this that the people can rely on without being afraid of going to jail, of legal consequences for their behavior in the privacy of their own home, the things that they do, just to enjoy themselves, right? Without necessarily affecting anybody else's freedom, anybody else's life. Um, they are responsible for themselves, for not overdoing it, and for the way that they handle themselves in the context of that experience. Um, but I think people are a lot less likely to die um, if they have a safe product, a safe alternative to what's going around these days, and if they're not afraid of legal repercussions for seeking help, either for addiction or for, potentially dying because they had too much of something. I also think it would open up a lot more research into these compounds. Um, if they were legal products, we could start to learn more how they work and how to help people that do have issues with them. I also think that it would allow companies to create better alternatives to the existing drugs that we have, to create potentially less toxic alternatives, um, and ones that may be associated with better life outcomes than the drugs that are currently in circulation, which is another potential way I could see it improving public health. Um, on another level, I think this would be very good for public safety, because all of the money that we are putting toward um, fighting the drug trade ironically increases the violence associated with the drug trade. There's a really good book called The Good Cop, Bad War by the writer Neil Woods, who was previously a police officer for the Metropolitan Police. He went after groups like the Burger Bar Boys and things like that. Um, and he talks in his books about how the Met would take out a gang, and a new gang would simply take the territory that that gang previously occupied. But in order to remain in control of it, they would engage in more violent tactics than the previous gang. Because the assumption would be, okay, well, the other gang wasn't violent enough. The other gang didn't do enough to consolidate power, so we need to do even more things to ensure that there are not undercover cops within our ranks, etc. Um, and this has the impact of increasing crime. So as enforcement increases, crime also increases because the drug trade becomes more violent, and because monopolies are increasingly created in place of the old way, which was lots of different criminal groups competing with one another. This is also what we've seen in Sweden with IDEs being detonated in the streets and things like this. This is also what we have seen in Mexico and in the United States. It simply doesn't work. Even in countries that supposedly, um, have a very strict approach to drugs, you also see this occur. The Yakuza. The Yakuza in Japan derive a massive amount of power from having complete control over the drug trade. And this is at the same time that every year you see massive, massive amounts of drugs seized in Japanese airports. And if you want to get a sense for what the population must be consuming, just look at how much gets seized. Because what is actually getting seized is just a tiny fraction of what is circulating in the public, because the majority of it is getting to its destination. The majority of it is getting out. And as a result of that, you end up seeing you end up seeing a lot of people who are likely to be using drugs. They're just not visible to the public because Japanese society has so much shame associated with drug use that they manage to hide it their whole life. And this is to say nothing about the drugs that are actually legal in Japan. Like, there are all kinds of benzodiazepines and other sedative narcotics that were developed specifically for the Japanese market that millions of people are taking every single night, which is definitely a form of drug abuse, or at least it's a form of drug dependence, but it's not talked about because it's legal and normalized. And it's the same thing in China, right, with the triads. The triads control a massive amount of industry within China focused on producing narcotics. They bribe local officials in order to continue doing their operations, and there is an understanding that as long as they continue laundering money for certain CCP officials, they can continue doing their business. And as a result, there are a lot of factory workers in China that use stimulants and come home and use ketamine and things like that. A lot of people in Hong Kong use ketamine. And it goes on and on. And of course, they use violence and intimidation to do the things that they're doing, but the government covers it up because they don't want to be associated with the activities of a criminal organization that they actively work with overseas even. The triads right now in the United States control $1 billion industry of illicit marijuana trade. And this is at the same time that the Chinese government is using them to actively spy on international students, as well as to launder money for them in offshore accounts in order to get around strict currency control regulations that exist in China. So there's this dynamic that exists in literally every country that you could name. Every country has a drug problem, and in every country the drug war has failed because there is arguably some sort of natural human curiosity towards these things, and in most cases drug use is benign, it is not harmful, and it is relatively neutral, if not positive, which is, bringing that up is not meant to distract from the fact that there is a lot of problems associated with consistent use, or there are a lot of problems associated with consistent use. Um, and it's not to glorify the usage of these things either, but more so to open the door to have an honest conversation, a nuanced conversation about the pros and cons of our current approach to these compounds. Because I would argue that the policy approach that we've taken thus far has been extremely destructive to human life, not just insofar as it has increased overdoses or put people in jail, resulting in records that create barriers to employment and housing, thereby furthering crime and recidivism in those individual cases, but also in terms of how it has reduced public safety because of the adverse enforcement mechanisms that we use, serving to create new monopolies that are more violent than the ones that we've taken out. So really the whole system needs to be changed. We need a regulatory framework that respects people's right to experiment with their own bodies, one that sees everyone as an individual who has a right to make choices about how they want to experience this world, about their own consciousness, right? And I think only then would we see massive amounts of crime get reduced. Um, and I mean, I didn't even mention, right? Like, the money that these guys make from selling drugs is then used to buy more weapons, to engage in more violence. It is then used to bribe more public officials and pay off more judges. Like, there's no scenario in which these guys are fully taken out. The only way to do that is to eradicate people's desire to experiment with drugs, which is something you will never be able to do. You will never be able to do that. For as long as humans are able to make choices about what they think and what they don't think, and to decide what they like and what they don't like, that is always going to happen. It doesn't matter how much you stigmatize it, people will just do it in the dark. They'll do it without your consent, without you knowing, and they're more likely to die that way. So, worse public health outcomes overall when you take that approach. But also you're not dissuading a large group of people. So, yeah, needless to say, I have a mountain of problems with the way that we approach this topic. And I didn't even scratch the surface, right? Like, there's so many things. There's so many things I could talk about with respect to this that I'm not even getting into right now. But I guess that all of that is to say, I have done a lot of thinking about this. It's a topic that I think is extremely important because it has to do with one of the most vulnerable populations in the world right now, which is people who consume drugs. These people are very vulnerable to the legal system. They're very vulnerable to death, and they're very vulnerable to exploitation. And the way that we're currently doing things only serves to further marginalize them, which I think is wrong. I think it's bad. I think we should be increasing our tax revenue while taking revenue away from criminals and diverting that money to the public health system, which could then help a lot of these people that desperately need it. That is my vision. That is my vision. You also wouldn't have to pay nearly as much money on the prison system either, because a huge portion of the people that are behind bars wouldn't be behind bars anymore. So it would be good for people on so many different levels, but I don't know when, the time will come when we start to have a more rational perspective on this. I think, we're getting there with cannabis, we're getting there with psychedelics, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see what the appetite is on the rest of this stuff, because um, progress generally happens slow. I mean, they say that what is it, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I don't know. Every day I'm I'm a little skeptical of that claim. I would like for it to be true, but we'll have to see, right? Um, this was originally a video about how I don't want to consume caffeine, but it ended up being a video about your right to consume everything, which is one that I believe in very strongly. I mean, just the fact that you exist should be an affirmation of that. You literally exist. You're trying to tell me that some bureaucrat in the government should tell you, you know, if you should be able to modulate your serotonin or dopamine receptors in a specific way? I don't think they should have the ability to say that. I would say that that's a human rights violation, that it violates your constitutional right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. If we really believe that you have an inalienable right to those things, um, then why are we preventing people from engaging in a behavior that many of them would do in pursuit of happiness? It may not be the way that I intend to pursue happiness, but it is, for one reason or another, the way that others might. It may be a tool in their toolbox, um, in pursuit of a happier life. For some, the moderate use of these things does in fact work in service of that goal, um, and even in some cases being dependent on certain things, depending on the individual and their circumstance. I I try to keep an open mind towards that, and I think a lot of the data that we have would substantiate that, would justify that kind of open-mindedness. Um, but needless to say, uh, as a society, we're not there yet, which I find to be pretty sad.